As the death toll in Gaza rises, so does the toll on Palestinian journalists. In its annual report, the Committee to Protect Journalists said 99 journalists and media workers worldwide were killed while doing their job last year. They include 72 Palestinian journalists killed by Israeli forces. That's nearly 75% of the worldwide total. Last year was the highest number of recorded deaths of journalists since 2015. And the period with most fatalities since the organization began documenting them in 1992. And even when they're not on the job, Palestinian journalists living in Gaza face the risk of Israeli bombardment. The Gaza Media Office says at least 126 Palestinian media workers have been killed since Israel's war began. Journalists working in conflict areas are protected under international humanitarian law. Palestinian journalists accuse Israel of repeatedly violating that law and of killing colleagues who are telling the world what's happening in Gaza. Well, we can now speak to Jody Ginsburg from New York, who's the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks for your time with us on Al Jazeera. So, as I just read out your report, the statistic is that more than 3/4 of the 99 journalists and media workers who died worldwide in 2023 were killed in Israel's war on Gaza. I mean, this is a very, very depressing statistic and really illustrates how deadly this war has been on journalists and particularly Palestinian journalists.
Absolutely. This war is unprecedented in terms of the threat to journalists. We documented 77 journalists killed in the Israel-Gaza war. 72 of those are Palestinians. And what's important to remember about this particular war is that Gazan journalists are the only journalists able to report on what's happening inside Gaza. International journalists have not been able to get in. They've not been allowed in except on very, very controlled trips that are overseen by the Israeli army. So we are entirely reliant on those journalists who are risking their lives to bring us this story.
And in your mind, is there any doubt that journalists are being targeted in this war?
Well, we're investigating at least a dozen cases where we think that journalists have been deliberately targeted. We've seen the case, for example, of Samer Abudaqa, the Reuters journalist who was killed on the Lebanese border. There have been a number of independent reports indicating that he was clearly wearing press insignia. He was with other journalists in an area known to be an area where journalists operate, and yet was targeted by an Israeli strike, and there are a number of other cases that we're looking into.
As you were just saying, the vast majority of the journalists, 72, were killed in the Israeli attacks on Gaza. Look, there's been a lot of criticism sort of over double standards. Do you think that the global reaction would have been different? The outrage would have been a little bit more if these were Western journalists, for example?
Israel has long been one of the most divisive countries to cover. I've been a journalist for 25 years, and that's long been the country, the issue that has divided international media, international politicians more than anything. So it's sadly unsurprising, I think, that we've seen a hesitancy to come out publicly in support of our journalist colleagues in Gaza, who are doing work that the international journalistic community is entirely reliant on to bring it the information, to bring the public information about the war inside Gaza.
So as the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists, are you disappointed that there haven't been more calls, louder calls of enough is enough, of the killing of these journalists, and as you're saying, in some cases, the targeting of them?
I am disappointed, frankly, at the lack of public solidarity that we've seen. I think it's really important that we let our colleagues inside Gaza, but also in the region, know that we stand with them, that we're there to support them, so that we can make sure that that press freedom and journalists are protected, not just at this moment, at this crucial moment in Gaza, but also globally at a time when journalists are under threat everywhere.
What more can organizations like yours do? I mean, I know that you've said that the CPJ has raised concerns about the apparent targeting of members of the media by Israeli forces. Besides raising concerns. I mean, what more needs to be done now? What type of action needs to be taken?
Well, it's very important that these killings are thoroughly investigated and that those responsible are held accountable. We're still in the middle of a war, so we don't expect those investigations to take place now. We're pushing for international mechanisms to make sure that those are properly investigated. We can use mechanisms including ICJ, the international, the ICC, UN bodies. There are a number of bodies that we can use to push for this. Unfortunately, justice takes a long time, and we don't expect that to happen immediately. But we continue to do the work of documenting, the painstaking work of documenting that will hopefully provide the evidence that can be used when these cases are fully brought to investigations.
All right, Jodie Ginsberg, thank you for joining us from New York.
Thank you.